Welcome to French Grammar Lessons number 8 by myself, Mr. Crucides. This lesson is all about the past tense using etre verbs. Probably not a good idea to have a look at this lesson unless you've fully understood the presentation about the normal past tense using avoir verbs. But assuming you've got a good understanding of that, then etre verbs shouldn't be too difficult for you. First of all, a quick recap about the past tense in English. As I always say, you can't learn a verb tense in a foreign language unless you know what that verb tense is in English. So the past tense is used to describe an event which happened or which has happened. So for example, he played or he has played. So in English we have two past tenses. One has the word have or has in it, the other one doesn't. And in French, the good news is they only have one past tense, which looks more like the he has played. They always put in the word have or has, even if they wanted just to say he played. So that makes it a lot easier for us as English speakers, because if we're translating he played or he has played, it's the same. For the French, it's harder because they have to decide, oh, do I translate this as he played or do I translate this as he has played, which is right. But that's not something we have to worry about. So the past tense, sometimes called the passé composé, is very easy. You need a subject, I, you, he, she, it, we, you, they. Could be the name of a person, Steve, Gary, Bob, Bill, my parents, the cat, the dog, the car. That's the easy part, sticking in the subject. Then you need part of the verb avoir, that's the verb to have. So that's j'ai, tu as, il a, nous avons, vous avez, ils ont. And that's the bit you always forget, so don't forget that part. And finally, a past participle. And remembering that a past participle, that's if we're talking about ER verbs, the participle ends with E accent. If we're talking about RE verbs, the past participle ends in U. And if we're talking about IR verbs, then the past participle ends in the letter I. Anyway, so for etre verbs, it's exactly the same steps. You need a subject, but instead of using part of the verb avoir, the verb to have, you use part of the verb être, which is the verb to be, then followed by a past participle. That's the only difference. Instead of using avoir, use être. There's the verb être, so we go je suis, tu es, il est, nous sommes, vous êtes, ils sont. So that's a verb you need to memorize. So when do you use être in the past tense? There are quite a few verbs and reflexive verbs take etre in the past tense as well, but let's just focus on the easy ones and the common ones. So these verbs coming up, they take être, not avoir in the past tense. So it goes subject, être, past participle, not subject, avoir, past participle. Aller, arriver, rester, partir, sortir, and rentrer. All of those verbs have regular past participles. So aller becomes the E, so all the ones ending in ER become E accent, the IR ones become just I at the end. So partir becomes parti. So here are some examples of the past tense with etre verbs. Remember, subject, part of the verb être, and a past participle. So I went. Following the regular rules, you would expect it to be j'ai allé. Remember the past participle E accent, but it's not j'ai allé, it is je suis allé. You arrived, you would expect it to be tu as arrivé, but it's not, it's tu es arrivé. So it's a bit confusing when you translate it, because tu es arrivé can be translated two ways. It can mean you arrived and you have arrived. Now if you were to logically translate you have arrived, well, you know that you have is tu as from the verb avoir, meaning to have, but these verbs are irregular, they take être, so it's not tu as arrivé, it's tu es arrivé, which literally would translate as you are arrived, but that makes no sense to us at all in English, so it's probably best not to even think about translating it using the verb to be. Anyway, just translate it as you arrived, or possibly you have arrived. Don't be confused by the fact that it's got the verb to be and not to have. The key thing is that what you're likely to get wrong is when you're trying to make a verb in the past tense. So just remember that if you're using the 6 verbs that I mentioned in the slide before, don't use avoir, just use the verb être in the middle. Other considerations when using the past tense with être verbs are that the past participle is like an adjective. Remember that French adjectives have to agree with the thing they're describing, both in terms of number, so singular or plural, and also they need to agree in terms of gender, so is what they're describing masculine or feminine. So that means you might need to add an extra E, add an extra S, or an extra E and an S. But luckily this is not going to affect the pronunciation. This is just a consideration if you're writing, but you've got to get these right. So if you wrote je suis allé, remember we're using être verbs, not avoir verbs. Aller is one of the 6 that we're studying that takes être in the past tense, so it's not j'ai allé, it's je suis allé. That's I went, and that's assuming that I am male. If you're female, you'd say je suis allé, but you'd write it with that extra E on the end. Because you're using être in the middle, the participle acts a bit like an adjective and has to agree with the subject. Here the subject, I, is a female I, so that's why the extra E is on allé. Il est allé, he went. She went, elle est allée, with an extra E, because the subject of that verb is female. Nous sommes allés, we went. Here the subject is plural, so we put an S on the participle. Why do we put an S on the participle? Because we're using être in the middle. This is not something we have to worry about if we're using avoir in the middle, only for être verbs. And ils sont allés is they went, and that's a male group. Again, the allés has an S on the end because it's plural, and if it's a female group, elles sont allées, you've got an E and an S. You've got an E because the subject is female, and an S because the subject is also plural. So don't forget the past participle acts also like an adjective. So here's the past tense in action from French into English. All of these are using être in the middle, not avoir, because these are all those 6 verbs that I introduced earlier. So why not press pause, just write down your translations or say them out loud before I give you the answers. Here are the answers. Notice that I've given you the option to translate them all in 2 ways. Remember, in English there are 2 past tenses, one with have, one without have. In French you would always put in the have. However, we're not putting the have in this lesson, we're putting the verb be in, because these are the ones that take être and not avoir. Just notice how notice the agreement of the participles in elle est allée, extra E. Nous sommes sortis, adding an S because it's plural. Vous êtes arrivés, adding an E and an S. So the you in that one is obviously a feminine you and a plural you. Ils sont partis, elles sont arrivées. Actually, the elles sont arrivées, there's a mistake there. There should be another E in there after the E accent because it's a female they. Okay, moving on. This is going to be quite difficult, so press pause, grab a piece of paper and a pen. Can you translate these into French? So remember, subject, not part of avoir but part of être, then the past participle. All the participles here are regular participles, but don't forget to agree them with the subject. So why not press pause and give this a crack before I give you the answers. Here are the answers. She returned, elle est rentrée, add an extra E because the subject's feminine. He left, il est parti. They went, ils sont sortis. That should be they went out, ils sont sortis, but notice they went would be ils sont allés. So apologies for that, but notice that the S is added onto the participle. I stayed, je suis resté with an extra E because I said it was a female I. He went out, il est sorti. You went, singular and feminine. Tu es allé with an extra E because it's a feminine you. We stayed, nous sommes restés. They arrived, ils sont arrivés. Those last 2 with an extra S because it's plural. You went out, vous êtes sortis, adding, so the participle of sortir is sorti, ending in an I, but we're adding an E because it's feminine, and we're adding an S because it's because I said that it's a plural you. He went, il est allé, and she stayed, elle est restée, adding that e because the subject is feminine. So a recap. To say that you or somebody else did or has done something, you need to use part of the verb avoir with a participle. You need to remember how the participles are formed from the 3 verb groups. You need to learn avoir by heart. You also need to learn those irregular past participles too. But the key thing from today's presentation is you need to remember that those 6 verbs, they don't take avoir, they take être. That means you need to learn the verb être off by heart as well. And finally, you need to remember that if you're using a past participle with être, then those past participles, well, you will be using a past participle if you're making a past tense. These participles need to agree with the subject. So add an e to make it feminine and add an s to make it plural. If it's feminine and it's plural, add an e and an s. That's all you need to know.